Dr. Moore, obviously, we're at a time of declining trust in our institutions, whether they be social, religious, political, educational, so many others. To what extent do you think the decline is due to a lack of leadership in our institutions, particularly ethical leadership?
I think that that's a key part of it. There's a sense of disappointment on the part of many people in leaders that they respected. I see that quite a bit in religious communities. There's a kind of fraying that happens after a series of institutional failures or personal scandals. If we think about when I was a teenager, there were the national news was covering a series of TV evangelist scandals of various sorts. And it was deeply disconcerting to me, even though I was not part of the institutions that any of those evangelists led. My local church was quite different. But it still caused a rattling. If the people in those communities couldn't trust their leaders, then how do I know that I can trust mine? And so when these things happen, it doesn't just affect that one institution or even the a constellation of institutions around it. It tends to wear down trust everywhere. And we're seeing that quite a bit in religious communities of people wondering whether religion is just a means to an end, a political end or an economic end. Obviously, I do not believe that it is or that it should be, but that's a question that tends to erode trust.
So you mentioned your teen years, and you've written about this a little
Mhm.
bit. Can you expand on that and sort of the disillusion you saw, some of the scandals that were happening at that time? How did it personally impact you and then your own journey towards becoming a leader within the church?
Well, I was about 15 years old in coastal on living on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, and one of the things that I was seeing in Bible Belt religion um, was a breakdown of trust. I saw racism that was covered up sometimes by spiritual justifications. I saw scandals being covered up, often with the justification that the mission is more important. These sorts of things cause, and I saw a great deal of political emphasis, of surging political emphasis that scared me even when I agreed with the political positions, because I could see that these weren't uh, uh, these weren't applications from from something clearly revealed in the Bible, but the Bible was being used to support these positions because of the politicians who held to those positions. So it caused me to wonder whether Christianity simply was a hood ornament for Southern culture or some political movement, and that sent me into a great spiritual crisis. It was a dark time. Thankfully, I had read the Chronicles of Narnia so many times as a child that I recognized the name C.S. Lewis on the spine of Mere Christianity in the bookstore, took it home and read it. And that was a transformative experience for me in shoring up my faith, not because of the arguments that Lewis was making, but because of the way he was making them. He seemed to take the reader seriously and to speak with a kind of honesty and authenticity that I believed I could trust him. This was the same person who would say in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, for instance, now in an aside to the reader, now you shouldn't actually go into a wardrobe. That same sort of demeanor I could read in the text, and so there was a rebuilding of trust in another voice that enabled me to work through that spiritual crisis. And that's one of the reasons why I spend most of my time right now thinking about other people who are in the same place I was in as a 15-year-old, who are wondering if everything is just at its core about power. And I believe that I believe that that's not the case. And so I want to speak to people who are in that situation.
So expand on that a little bit, because, I think that's a really interesting point, that you have been able to maintain your faith. So many other people have seen these same issues and have, walked away.
Yes.
And so how has that informed your leadership when you were at ERLC and the work you're doing now? Sort of how do you go about that?
Well, I think a big part of it is understanding and knowing why people are having crises of trust. 10 years ago, if someone came to me having a spiritual crisis, I might assume that it was intellectual, that they couldn't believe in the miraculous anymore, or I might assume that it was moral. They believed that the moral demands of the church were too much for them. That's not what I'm seeing right now. What I'm seeing right now is more it's not people who are saying, I can't believe what the church teaches. It's people who are saying, I don't think the church believes what the church teaches. And the alarming thing to me is that this isn't just a North American phenomenon. We see this all over the world. I mean, think about the state of the Catholic Church in Ireland. There was a fascinating book written about this called Mass Exodus, talking about how the revelations of sexual abuse cover-ups in Ireland, the effect that that had on people's trust in any sort of religious institution. So, so I think that in many cases we have to understand that the lack of trust is well earned by many institutions, and that's especially true when we look at sexual abuse cover-ups that seem to transcend every other kind of religious divider. This is a horrific crisis in multiple religious institutions. And then when we see the ways that religions are used for political purposes. Tobias Kramer, the scholar at Oxford, I believe, maybe Cambridge, but I think Oxford, has written about the way that Christianity is used in Europe, where someone may be holding a giant cross at a rally, or in France, a statue of Joan of Arc. And then when one talks to these people will find out they really don't believe. They're agnostics or atheists in many cases, but these religious symbols are a stand-in for what they want to happen culturally or politically. I mean, that's always been a temptation. Any political movement wants to co-opt a religious movement because then that political movement can be made transcendent and beyond question. But we see that happening quite a bit right now in ways that are shaking to people.
Yeah.
And also if if people start to assume that religion is just a means to an end, sooner or later they start to ask what that end is, and they simply can pursue it if they want without giving up a Sunday morning. So the sense of transcendence, when that is removed from any religious community in fact or in reputation, it leads not only great harm to society, but great harm to that institution.
Right. So this concept, I want to talk a little bit about religious liberty, which is,
Mhm.
of course, an important concept here. But you've also talked about some of the recent ways that religious liberty has come up in COVID and mask and vaccine mandates. And you wrote, quote, "If we call religious liberty what is not religious liberty, we jeopardize religious liberty." How do you define religious liberty?
I define religious liberty as the ability for religious communities and individuals to carry out the beliefs and practices of their religion without coercion from the state or from the culture. What concerned me in the era of COVID was that one would see some legitimate religious liberty concerns. There were state governments and city councils that would restrict religious communities in ways that they did not restrict other people, and would see a liquor store or a casino as being essential, but not a gathering of people in a church or a synagogue or any other religious gathering. That those are real challenges. But then there would be other times where people would claim that religious liberty means that there aren't any um, competing interests for public health or some other reason, which has never been what religious liberty is about. Sometimes people will say, well, if you believe in religious liberty, that means that people can do anything if their religion demands it. They can sacrifice children, or they can steal and defraud. No, religious liberty means that religious liberty is in continuity with any other kind of freedom. Uh, the state has the state has to prove that it has a compelling interest. In the case of public health, there is a compelling interest. But also, as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act put it, and I think it applies much more broadly in our understanding of religious freedom, that the state should pursue the least restrictive means toward that end. And that's where we had some problems during the era of COVID. But if with religious liberty already so misunderstood, because religion is often misunderstood, it is really damaging to religious liberty for us to claim or to act as though religious liberty means anarchy. It doesn't. It never has.
Let me jump in here with a question you said a little while ago about churches not actually acting like they believe what they teach. So, talk a little bit more about how you think that might be impacting churches in general today, and what might be done to change some of that.
Well, I think there are a number of challenges right now. Some of that has to do with the track record of some churches and other religious organizations. Sometimes, whenever there is some sort of cover up of any kind of scandal, almost always someone is justifying that with the mission. We really don't want to bring this out into the light because it will jeopardize the mission, and it will give Jesus a bad reputation if it's a Christian institution. When that is completely opposite of the approach that we should take of accountability and openness, and having religious institutions being the places that can be the most trusted. That starts to erode the trust externally and internally. But also, there are the same pressures that we see in almost every institution and every aspect of American life right now, showing up in churches. So every day, I will talk to pastors who are demoralized and exhausted because they have people within their congregations who expect them to take certain political stands or certain public health stands, or to be in the middle of whatever is being debated on Facebook right now in ways that are exhausting to these pastors. And so uh, that also is happening, and there's no island of refuge in American life right now. It's hard for me to think of, perhaps the military, but apart from the military, it's hard for me to think of any other institution that's not facing these pressures, which is why I will often find myself having the exact same conversation with a pastor and a member of Congress and a business leader, because they're facing the same things.
So how do you think that religious institutions can avoid the politicalization of religion while also at the same time taking seriously, the biblical challenges or charges for justice and mercy and righteousness, et cetera?
Well, I think one of those ways is to have an engagement, but a distance from political activity, and that is to see the role of the religious institution in shaping and forming people's consciences, so they are able to recognize justice and injustice, righteousness and unrighteousness, but not as an extension of any government or any political party or any political movement. The good news is, generationally, I see that happening. There are very few evangelical churches in my tradition, evangelical churches that are young, made up of young people who want anything to do with that sort of politicization. As a matter of fact, when I'm dealing with evangelicals under the age of 30, I'm often having to persuade them away from the other extreme, which is to be completely unconcerned with social and political engagement because of the ways that they've seen that go awry. So that's good news. I think that is, and the reasons for that are usually rooted in a sense of religion as transcendent. They see it as not just being a means to an end. They didn't grow up in a culture where they're expected to be a member of a church in order to be a good person. So that's part of it, is that these younger evangelicals really do see the institution, the religious institution, as being more than just another institution.
Well, let me ask you a related and final question from my end, and that would be related to this is the rise of the nuns, people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious. There are a lot of data showing how that is one of the largest, fastest growing movements today when it comes to religion. We also are seeing at the same time a decline in church membership. So to what extent do you think this is a function of religious leadership or the lack thereof of religious leadership, or what it might be, a function of just personal crisis of faith?
Well, I think there's a both and there. There's some data suggesting that a great deal of the loss of identification or membership within religious communities can be traced back to politicization. Robert Putnam and David Campbell's work has suggested that, and others have as well. But also, I think we're facing some cultural changes that I don't know that they are resulting in secularization as much as they are resulting in a kind of honesty that perhaps would not have been the case before. Someone in the 20th century to identify himself or herself as having no religious affiliation would be stepping out into very unknown territory and would be, at least in some parts of the 20th century, suspected of being on the other side of the Cold War against atheistic Soviet Union. That has changed. So the kind of cultural Christianity that expects people to be part of a church in order to find a spouse or to be in business or so forth, that's gone. At the same time, though, it's been replaced in some aspects with a different sort of cultural Christianity, which is a Christianity that is social and political, but doesn't go to church. I can see this quite often with people that I've known for years posting Christian memes on Facebook, and I know they haven't been to church since the first Bush administration. And it's not hypocrisy. They're not hiding that. They don't see how the one has anything to do with the other. So that's a reality that has changed. So you see two things happening at once in at least some of the survey research that we have right now. You see some people reacting to the politicization of some religious communities by walking away from them. And we can see that. I see that all the time on college campuses, where campus ministries don't want to use the word evangelical because the other students will assume that that's a political claim. You see some people walking away. You also see people claiming the name evangelical because their politics lines up with what they see as being evangelical politics. That's an alarming trend to me. Both aspects of that are alarming, and it calls for it calls for a renewed leadership and witness that really takes seriously the transcendent claims of the gospel and what it means to form genuine communities. When we see loneliness all around us, and we see the way that loneliness is resulting often in fear and anger, the stakes are all the higher for church communities to actually be communities.